Imagine this, you live in a small southern town in the 1970s. A place where everybody knows everybody, where church on Sunday is the heartbeat of the community, and where sweet grandmothers bake pies, rock babies, and whisper gentle prayers over the sick. But what if one of those church-going grandmothers wasn't who she seemed to be? What if behind the soft smile and kind words was a woman with a secret so terrifying, it turned faith into fear and caregiving into cold-blooded killing? Tonight, we begin the chilling story of Velma Barfield, the grandmother who poisoned the people who trusted her most, and became the first woman in American history to be executed by lethal injection. This is part 1 of her story. Life in Cumberland County. To understand how Velma Barfield was able to hide in plain sight, you first have to picture the world she lived in. Cumberland County, North Carolina, during the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a place where life moved slowly. Tobacco fields stretched across red clay soil, pine trees lined the back roads, and towns like Parkton and Fayetteville were stitched together by faith, tradition, and trust. In Parkton, a tiny farming town with fewer than 500 people, the Baptist church wasn't just for Sunday worship, it was the community's living room. High school basketball games could pack a gym with neighbors from 3 counties over, and the general store was where stories, gossip, and promises were exchanged with a handshake. In this world, a grandmother was seen as the safest person you could know. No one would ever suspect a grandmother of being capable of evil. And that's exactly why Velma Barfield was able to kill. A childhood of poverty and prayer. Velma was born Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, South Carolina, but grew up near Fayetteville, North Carolina. She was the second child and oldest daughter in a family of 9 kids. Life on the Bullard family farm was tough. They grew tobacco and cotton, lived without electricity or running water, and when nature called, the children had to walk into the woods because they didn't have an indoor toilet. But poverty wasn't shameful back then, it was just life. The Bullards also had something that held them together: faith. Velma's parents were strict Pentecostals. Church wasn't optional. Prayer wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Velma grew up with the Bible in one hand and chores in the other. She learned responsibility early, taking care of younger siblings, cooking, cleaning, and helping in the fields. At school, though, Velma shined. Teachers described her as bright, quiet, and always willing to help classmates. She was a talented reader and writer. Her report cards were filled with good grades. For a little while, it seemed like Velma might escape her family's struggles through education. A taste of freedom. When she hit her teenage years, Velma discovered something unexpected: basketball. She wasn't built like an athlete, but she was quick and smart. She could read the game, predict plays, and help her team win. Basketball became her escape from the endless chores at home. For a couple of hours, she wasn't just a farm girl, she was part of something bigger. But that didn't last long. When Velma's mother gave birth to twins, everything changed. Suddenly, Velma was pulled off the team and forced back into housework. Her mother needed help, and as the oldest daughter, Velma had no choice. The disappointment crushed her. She had found something she loved, only to have it ripped away. It was during this time of frustration and suffocation that Velma met Thomas Burke. Young love, old rules. Thomas wasn't the most handsome boy around, but he had something Velma craved: kindness. He was gentle, funny, and treated her with a respect she rarely saw at home. The 2 teenagers started a quiet romance, talking between classes and sneaking glances at church. But Velma's father had strict rules about dating. Even when she turned 16, he refused to allow serious courtship. That only made Velma and Thomas more determined. At 17, desperate to escape her stifling home life, Velma made a bold choice: she and Thomas eloped. In 1949, in a simple ceremony before a justice of the peace, they became husband and wife. Building a life together. The newlyweds moved into a small house in Parkton, a place that belonged to Velma's relatives. It wasn't much, but to Velma, it felt like freedom. For the first time in her life, she had her own home, her own choices, her own future. The early years of their marriage were happy. Velma and Thomas shared dreams of building the stable, loving family they both wanted. They laughed, they worked hard, and for a while, everything seemed possible. But as anyone in a true crime story knows, happiness rarely lasts. The car accident that changed everything. In 1965, tragedy struck. Thomas was driving home from his job at a textile mill when he lost control on a rain-slicked country road. The crash left him with a severe concussion and lingering injuries that would never fully heal. At first, it seemed like he would recover. He returned to work after a few weeks. But then came the headaches. They weren't normal headaches. They were crippling. Pain so sharp it left him curled up for hours, sometimes days. The headaches cost him his job, and soon medical bills began piling up. The Burke's dream life began to unravel. Financial pressure mounted, and Thomas's frustration grew. His once gentle nature soured. The man Velma had married slowly disappeared, replaced by anger, illness, and despair. And for Velma, that darkness would become the seed of something much worse. Movie camera outro for part 1. This was just the beginning of Velma Barfield's story. A childhood of faith and poverty, a young marriage filled with hope, and then tragedy that set her on a deadly path. In part 2, we'll dive deeper into how Thomas Burke's struggles, Velma's growing addictions, and a web of lies would transform her from a struggling housewife into a calculating killer. Make sure you subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, turn on the bell, and tell us in the comments, would you ever suspect your grandmother of murder? Because in Parkton, North Carolina, nobody did. Right finger. That's part 1, about 1,000 words, rewritten in a suspenseful, YouTube horror-style script. Would you like me to continue parts 2 to 10 in the same style, each approximately 1,000 words, so you have the full series ready for your channel? Velma Barfield, the killer grandmother. Part 2, the fire and the first death. Movie camera hook opening for YouTube video. Picture this. You're a child asleep in a small farmhouse in rural North Carolina. The smell of smoke begins to fill the air. Flames crawl up the walls. By the time the neighbors notice, the house is already an inferno. Inside, a man is dead. Everyone believes it's a tragic accident. But what if it wasn't? What if someone made sure he never left that house alive? This is part 2 of the story of Velma Barfield, the grandmother who turned trust into terror. Alcohol, pain, and resentment. By the mid-1960s, Velma's husband, Thomas Burke, was a broken man. After the car accident that left him with permanent injuries, his world spiraled downward. Like many men of his generation who couldn't afford doctors, Thomas turned to the only medicine he could find, alcohol. What started as a beer to dull the pain became bottles hidden in closets, in sheds, under the bed. His drinking grew worse with every month that passed. For Velma, who had been raised under the strict rules of Pentecostal Christianity, alcohol wasn't just a bad habit, it was a sin. In her eyes, Thomas wasn't just failing as a husband, he was falling into the hands of the devil. She tried to stop him. She dumped his liquor down the sink. She searched the house for bottles like a detective. She even made her children help her spy on their father. But each attempt only drove Thomas deeper into his addiction, and deeper into resentment toward his wife. The Burke household became a battleground. Yelling, silent stares, slammed doors. The sweet love that had once held them together had been replaced by bitterness and suspicion. A marriage at war. Thomas felt humiliated. He could no longer work steadily. He was in pain every day, and now the woman he married seemed to be against him. Velma, meanwhile, felt trapped with a man who was no longer the kind boy she had fallen for. The breaking point came when Velma made a decision that would haunt their marriage forever. She had Thomas committed to Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh for treatment. To Thomas, it was the ultimate betrayal. He hadn't agreed, he hadn't asked for help. And now the whole town knew he'd been locked away as a drunk. Though the program at Dorothea Dix helped him dry out, Thomas came home bitter, cold, and distant. Whatever love had survived between him and Velma was gone. Their marriage was now nothing more than arguments about money, the children, and Thomas's constant anger. During his absence, Velma had started taking prescription tranquilizers, first Valium, then stronger pills. What began as help for stress soon turned into dependency. By the time Thomas came back, Velma was hooked. The stage was set for something dark. The Night of Fire. On April 4, 1969, everything changed. That night, Thomas had been drinking again. He wasn't blackout drunk, but he was groggy, stumbling, and out of sorts. Velma made an unusual choice. She told her children they were coming with her to run errands, late at night. This was not like Velma at all. She rarely left the house after dark, and the errands she mentioned could have easily waited until morning. But she insisted, packed up the kids, and drove away, leaving Thomas alone in the house. When they returned a few hours later, the Burke home was already a roaring inferno. Flames shot into the night sky. The Parkton Volunteer Fire Department rushed to the scene, but there was little they could do. The fire had eaten through the old wooden house too quickly. Inside, firefighters found Thomas's body. He was in the bedroom. The medical examiner determined he had died from smoke inhalation before the fire burned through him. The official explanation: Thomas must have passed out while smoking in bed. It was common in rural North Carolina, tragic, but believable. Velma collapsed in tears, screaming, trying to throw herself into the burning house as neighbors restrained her. To everyone watching, she was the picture of devastation. The widow's grief. The community wrapped its arms around Velma. Parkton was a small place. Everyone knew the Burkes. To lose Thomas in such a horrible way was heartbreaking. At the funeral, Velma sobbed at the front pew of Parkton Baptist Church. She spoke softly about Thomas's struggles, about how much he had suffered. She thanked neighbors for their prayers. She looked like a woman completely broken by grief. But behind the tears, subtle cracks were forming in the story. Doubts in the ashes. Neighbors remembered something strange. In the days leading up to the fire, Velma had quietly removed certain valuables from the house. Family photos, important documents, a few small pieces of jewelry. When asked, she said she was cleaning them, or repairing them. But the timing seemed convenient. And then there was her choice to leave the house with the children that night. Why then? Why those vague errands? Most people dismissed the doubts. Velma was a widow now, and in their eyes, a victim. But then came the second fire. Just 3 months after the tragedy, smoldering debris on the vacant lot reignited, burning again. This time, insurance investigators took notice. Their findings triggered a payout to Velma. Combined with life insurance and donations from the church, she suddenly had more money than she had ever seen in her life. The widow who had once struggled to buy groceries now had security. Was it all a coincidence? Or had Velma planned it from the start? The birth of a predator. Whatever doubts people whispered about were drowned out by Velma's charm. She was soft-spoken, polite, and seemed completely devoted to her children. To the outside world, she was a woman who had endured tragedy and carried on with dignity. But something inside Velma had shifted. She had tasted what murder could do. It could remove obstacles. It could earn sympathy. It could even bring financial relief. Velma Barfield had just taken her first life, and she would not stop. A new target. Within 6 months of Thomas's death, Velma was already moving on. She set her sights on Jennings Barfield, a respected widower with land, money, and a reputation for integrity. He was known throughout Cumberland County as a man of stability, a man who had survived loss himself. To Jennings, Velma appeared to be exactly what he needed: a kind, hard-working woman who understood grief, who knew how to take care of a home, and who seemed completely devoted to him. But to Velma, Jennings wasn't just a chance at love. He was a chance at control, security, and the next step in a deadly pattern that had only just begun. Movie camera outro for Part 2. Thomas Burke's death was written off as an accident. The grieving widow played her role perfectly. But in truth, Velma had crossed a line she could never come back from. In Part 3, we'll follow her marriage to Jennings Barfield, and how this sweet grandmother's thirst for control, and poison, would claim even more lives. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, tap the bell, and let us know in the comments, would you have suspected Velma after that fire? Or would you, like her neighbors, have trusted the grieving widow with open arms? Because in Parkton, North Carolina, trust was the deadliest mistake of all. Right finger. That's Part 2 rewritten, approximately 1,000 words, in horror true crime narration style. Do you want me to continue with Part 3 next, where Velma's marriage to Jennings Barfield takes a dark turn? The Genius Killer, Part 3. Velma's second marriage should have been her salvation. To outsiders, it seemed like a respectable union, two widowed souls finding comfort in each other's company, blending families, and forging stability where loss had left cracks. But beneath the polished veneer of domestic order, the same shadow that had claimed Thomas lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Jennings Barfield was a man of discipline, respected in his community, admired for his business sense, and trusted by those who had known him for years. To him, Velma seemed like the perfect companion. She was devout, industrious, and attentive, a woman who knew how to create the illusion of warmth and order. She cooked elaborate meals, kept the house immaculate, and maintained an air of unwavering devotion to both Jennings and her faith. But perfection, when it masks decay, becomes something far more sinister. Velma's dependence on prescription drugs had not ended with Thomas's death. In fact, it had grown teeth. She now devoured pills like candy. Elavil for her depression, Sinequan for her anxiety, Tylenol laced with codeine for her aches, and Valium to lull her into sleep. Each prescription came from a different doctor, her deceit woven across county lines like a spider's web. No one saw the whole picture but Velma, and her need for the drugs became bottomless, an endless hunger that clawed at her until she found ways to feed it. And hunger always finds a way. At first, she dipped cautiously into Jennings' finances. A forged signature here, a quiet withdrawal there, small amounts that no careful man would notice immediately. Her skill was chilling in its precision. She mimicked his handwriting until it was indistinguishable. She staggered withdrawals across accounts so that no pattern emerged. It was theft dressed in the clothing of normality. For months, Jennings noticed nothing. When small discrepancies arose, Velma drowned him in tears, explanations, and justifications. Household costs, unexpected bills for the children, medical emergencies. Each lie slipped from her tongue with perfect rehearsed conviction. Jennings, though sharp, was also trusting, a fatal combination when matched against a predator like her. But predators cannot remain hidden forever. By early 1971, Jennings' longtime banker, Harold Mitchell, noticed something odd. The spending patterns didn't align with Jennings' cautious habits. Money flowed too freely, too often, with transactions that seemed reckless. Mitchell's suspicions grew, and he quietly approached Jennings, planting seeds of doubt that soon sprouted into a confrontation. The night Jennings challenged Velma was not a domestic quarrel, it was an eruption. He accused her of lies, theft, deception. For the first time, Velma was cornered, her mask threatened with exposure. Jennings was not weak like Thomas, nor blind with alcohol. He was strong, decisive, and unwilling to tolerate betrayal. He threatened divorce. He threatened to involve the police. He promised her that the truth would come out. For Velma, this was not merely a marital spat, it was the tightening noose around her throat. Divorce meant disgrace, prosecution, and ruin. But Velma had already learned one chilling lesson: when cornered, there was always a way out. And her way out was death. On March 22, 1971, Jennings Barfield sat at the dinner table, unaware that every bite he ate was a countdown. It began innocuously: stomach cramps, nausea, the sort of thing that could easily be dismissed as bad food. But soon the pain became unbearable, violent waves of vomiting and spasms twisting him into agony. Velma hovered over him like a dutiful wife, her hands cool on his forehead, her voice laced with trembling concern. Behind her eyes, though, calculation reigned. Hours passed, and Jennings' condition deteriorated. His chest seized with pain. His blood pressure plummeted. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically, puzzled by the violent collapse of an otherwise healthy man. His white blood cell count suggested infection, but no infection could be found. By dawn, Jennings was gone. The cause of death: heart failure brought on by what appeared to be gastric infection. No suspicion touched Velma. Her performance of grief was so convincing that even hardened physicians pitied her. She wept uncontrollably, collapsing in sorrow, requiring sedation to calm her. At the funeral, dressed in black with trembling hands clutching her Bible, she was the picture of tragedy, twice widowed in less than 2 years. The community rallied to her side, whispering about her terrible misfortune, about how strong she must be to endure such suffering. But Velma was not suffering. Velma was learning. Jennings' death left her wealthier than she had ever been. His life insurance, his land, his assets, all of it flowed into her hands. Unlike Thomas's fiery demise, Jennings' passing required no elaborate staging. The poison, arsenic, hidden in food and drink, had done its work flawlessly, mimicking a natural illness so closely that no one questioned it. Velma had perfected the art of invisible murder. She had become more than a grieving widow. She had become something colder, something patient and methodical. A predator who knew how to strike without leaving a trace. With her newfound wealth, Velma moved back to Fayetteville. To outsiders, this seemed like a decision rooted in grief, seeking comfort near family after tragedy. But Fayetteville offered her more than solace. It offered opportunity. Her father, Murphy Bullard, was already dying of lung cancer, his fate sealed by the natural course of disease. He required no intervention from Velma. But her mother, Lillian, was different. 74 years old, with a modest pension and carefully saved assets, Lillian represented both a problem and a solution. She trusted Velma implicitly, leaning on her daughter for help with finances, errands, and household tasks. And Velma, smiling sweetly, took control. Day after day, she visited, bringing meals, balancing checkbooks, writing letters. Lillian, frail and grateful, never suspected that each moment of help was another step deeper into betrayal. Velma studied her mother's handwriting, memorized account numbers, and soon began forging checks in her name. At first, the thefts were small, $20 here, $30 there, amounts so trivial they could be dismissed as ordinary expenses. But addiction does not remain small. By 1974, Velma was siphoning hundreds each month to feed her ravenous hunger for pills. And then came the sickness. Lillian began experiencing sudden, inexplicable illnesses. Crippling cramps twisted her stomach. Waves of nausea and diarrhea left her weak for days at a time. And always, Velma was there, nursing, soothing, offering special teas and broths. To doctors, the symptoms looked like food poisoning or stomach flu. Blood tests revealed nothing, and when others in the family shared meals with her, they remained perfectly fine. It was a mystery no physician could solve. But it was no mystery at all. Velma was experimenting. She had learned from Jennings how well arsenic could mimic disease, but now she wanted to master dosage. Too much, and death came too quickly, raising suspicion. Too little, and the victim recovered fully. With her mother, Velma found the perfect test subject. A woman who trusted her completely, who relied on her care, and who could not escape her reach. Each illness was a trial. Each recovery a lesson. Velma learned how much poison created sickness but not death, how long symptoms lasted, how doctors reacted. She was perfecting her craft, honing it with a scientist's precision and a killer's patience. And perhaps worst of all, she enjoyed the power. To watch her mother writhe in pain, knowing she controlled the suffering. To play the role of savior while secretly being the executioner. It was a performance of unimaginable cruelty, masked behind the gentle face of a daughter's devotion. Velma was no longer merely killing to solve problems. She was evolving into something far darker, an architect of pain, a conductor of death. And in Fayetteville, surrounded by family and neighbors who saw her as a woman of faith and sacrifice, no one suspected the horror that walked among them. Velma Barfield had tasted control, and control was addictive. The grandmotherly figure in her modest home was no victim of fate. She was its author. And she was just beginning. Right finger, would you like me to continue with part 4, another 1000 words, horror style, where Velma's experiments on her mother escalate into something even darker. Part 4, The Mother's Curse. By the summer of 1974, Velma had perfected her deception. What had once been a desperate woman stealing checks and fabricating excuses had evolved into a predator whose patience and precision masked the horrors she orchestrated. On the surface, she was a dutiful daughter, tenderly caring for her aging mother. To neighbors and church friends, she was the very picture of Southern devotion, a grieving widow, a God-fearing woman, a daughter who sacrificed her time and strength for family. But within the small brick home in Fayetteville, a much darker reality was unfolding. Lillian Bullard, Velma's 74-year-old mother, had always been a resilient woman. She had survived the Depression, raised her family with discipline and faith, and managed her finances with a stubborn pride that kept her modestly comfortable. But in Velma's hands, her strengths became vulnerabilities. Her trust in her daughter allowed Velma access to her finances, her meals, and, most chilling of all, her body. The first attacks were subtle. A spoonful of broth laced with a trace of arsenic. A cup of sweet tea brewed darker than usual, the metallic aftertaste disguised with extra sugar. The poison worked slowly, burrowing into Lillian's body with each dose, then retreating just before suspicion could take root. Days of violent nausea would fade, leaving her pale but alive. Dr. Stevenson, her longtime physician, noted the odd rhythm of her illnesses. Stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, symptoms consistent with food poisoning, but they recurred too often and without obvious cause. It may be her age, he told Velma once, shaking his head as he signed another prescription for anti-nausea tablets. The elderly can be fragile. Sometimes these things come and go without explanation. Velma nodded, her eyes shining with feigned worry. She even dabbed her eyes with a tissue, a performance so convincing that even the doctor left believing she was the victim of circumstance, not its architect. The horror was not merely in the physical suffering but in the psychological erosion. Lillian began to dread mealtimes. She questioned whether her food was spoiled, whether her body was betraying her, whether she was simply nearing death's door. At night, alone in her room, she would pray fervently for strength, whispering into the shadows, "Lord, don't take me yet. Not like this. Please, not like this." Velma, meanwhile, continued her experiments. She varied the dosage, observed the results, and kept mental notes as if she were conducting a private science of suffering. Sometimes the poison brought only weakness, other times, it pushed her mother to the brink of collapse. Velma learned precisely how much to administer to keep Lillian alive while still stealing from her accounts undetected. But even Velma's meticulous control could not mask the growing terror inside that house. One night, during a particularly violent episode, Lillian staggered from her bed and clutched at her daughter's arm, her eyes wild with pain and confusion. "Velma," she gasped, "it feels like something's eating me from the inside." Velma's face softened, her lips curving into a mask of sympathy. "It's just your age, Mama. Your body's weaker now. I'll make you some tea. It always helps, doesn't it?" But the look in Lillian's eyes lingered. Somewhere deep within her fading strength, she seemed to understand. She never accused Velma outright, but in her gaze, there was fear, not of sickness, but of betrayal. And that unspoken fear grew like mold in the corners of the house. Neighbors began whispering. They noticed Lillian's decline, and though Velma insisted she was doing everything possible, some remarked on how strangely she hovered. "She won't even let her mother eat unless she's the one serving it," one church friend muttered after visiting. Another recalled how Velma snapped when someone offered to bring Lillian homemade soup. "No, no, Mama can only eat what I prepare. Her stomach's too delicate." The house itself seemed to absorb the horror. Visitors swore the air inside felt heavy, as if the walls held the echoes of groans and whispered prayers. At night, Velma often sat awake at the kitchen table, the lamp casting her face in sharp shadows as she scribbled figures from her mother's checkbook. Outside, the cicadas droned, but inside, silence pressed in like a suffocating shroud. By late autumn, the strain on Lillian's body was undeniable. Her once strong frame was reduced to frailty, her hands trembled, her voice thinned. And yet, She clung to life with an almost supernatural resilience. Each dose of poison weakened her, but she endured, as though sheer willpower kept her tethered to this world. For Velma, this endurance was infuriating. She had expected her mother's decline to follow the same path as Jennings Barfield's, a swift descent masked by plausible symptoms. Instead, Lillian lingered, a constant reminder of Velma's half-completed crime. The more Velma stole, the more desperate she became to end the threat of discovery. The breaking point came one cold December evening. Lillian, too weak to rise from bed, lay staring at the ceiling. Her breath came shallow and ragged, and her skin was pale as candle wax. Velma entered with a tray, a cup of tea steaming in the dim light, a plate of toast buttered just enough to mask the bitterness that clung to the edges. "Drink this, Mama," Velma urged, lifting the cup to her lips. But Lillian turned her head weakly, her eyes filling with tears. "Velma," she whispered, "child, don't do this." The words froze in the air, more chilling than any accusation. For the first time, Velma's mask faltered. Her hands trembled as she forced the cup closer. "It's just tea, Mama. Please." But Lillian refused. She closed her eyes, her lips pressed tight, and shook her head as much as her frail body would allow. The refusal was small, almost pitiful, but it struck Velma like a curse. From that night forward, the house became unbearable. Velma could no longer escape the weight of her mother's eyes, the memory of that whispered plea. Even after increasing the dosages, even after forcing spoonfuls past trembling lips, she felt hunted by a gaze that seemed to follow her through every room. And when the end finally came, it was not the quiet victory Velma had envisioned. On a stormy night in early 1975, lightning split the sky as Lillian convulsed violently in her bed. Velma rushed to her side, performing her role with convincing panic, calling the doctor, pretending to pray, holding her mother's hand as it twitched and clenched. But in the final moments, as Lillian's body went rigid and her breath rattled to silence, her eyes snapped open wide. They fixed on Velma with a look so piercing, so filled with unspoken accusation, that Velma recoiled. And then, with a final gasp, Lillian was gone. The house fell into silence. The storm raged outside, but inside, Velma swore she heard her mother's voice lingering, whispering through the walls. Don't do this." Velma buried her mother with the proper displays of grief, sedated by doctors and comforted by neighbors who praised her devotion. The church whispered prayers over her bowed head, never suspecting the truth. On paper, it was another tragedy, another natural death. But Velma knew better. And when she returned to the now empty house, she realized something terrible: the silence had changed. It was no longer heavy but alive, as though her mother's spirit had not left, but lingered, watching, waiting, accusing. Velma had silenced her mother's body, but she had not silenced her mother's curse. And that curse would follow her forever. Checkmark. That's part 4, 1000 words, written as a horror story continuation. Would you like me to make part 5 even darker, where Velma's crimes start spiraling beyond family, and the curse presence grows stronger, almost like a supernatural haunting? Part 5 whispers in the dark. After her mother's funeral, Velma returned to the empty house, her footsteps echoing through rooms that seemed larger, colder, and unbearably still. The neighbors thought she was brave to live there alone, but Velma knew the truth: she wasn't alone at all. The first nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fits, broken by the echo of her mother's dying gasp. Velma would wake drenched in sweat, the bedsheets twisted tight around her limbs, certain she had heard that voice again. Don't do this." At first, she told herself it was grief, a guilty imagination. But as days stretched into weeks, the house began to change in ways she couldn't explain. The hallway outside her mother's bedroom grew colder than the rest of the house, no matter how high she turned up the heat. The rocking chair by the window, where Lillian had once sat with her Bible, sometimes moved on its own, creaking slowly, as if an unseen body pressed into it. And always, there were the whispers. Soft at first, like wind through the trees, but unmistakable once she listened. Her mother's voice, low and pained, weaving through the silence of the house. Velma tried to ignore it. She kept busy, writing checks from accounts that no longer belonged to her, forging her mother's shaky signature with practiced ease. She told herself she had survived worse, that what mattered was survival, money, freedom. But late at night, when the world was still and the shadows pressed in, she couldn't silence the thought. What if Mama hadn't really left? One evening, Velma sat at the kitchen table balancing her ledgers when the lamp above her flickered violently, then went out. She sighed, fumbling for a match, but before she could strike it, she heard the unmistakable scrape of the rocking chair upstairs. Slow, steady, back and forth, Velma froze, the match trembling between her fingers. She was certain she had left that chair wedged against the wall. Certain it couldn't move without being pulled. The sound grew louder. Creak, pause, creak, her heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, she struck the match and clutched it like a weapon, the tiny flame quivering in the draft that had crept into the house. She told herself it was rats, or perhaps the foundation settling, but deep down she knew, something else was there. Velma didn't sleep that night. She sat upright in bed with her Bible open, though she hadn't read more than a verse in months. The words blurred on the page as her eyes darted to every corner of the room. By dawn, she was trembling with exhaustion. But if the house haunted her, Velma soon discovered it also shielded her. With her mother gone, Velma was free to look elsewhere for companionship. Loneliness gnawed at her, but she knew how to use it as bait. She joined church groups, visited friends, and put on the mask of a grieving daughter looking for comfort. It wasn't long before she found another man willing to listen. Roland Stewart Taylor was a kind-hearted farmer, recently widowed himself. He had a gentle laugh and a way of speaking that reminded Velma of safety, a quality she hadn't felt in years. He visited often, bringing vegetables from his garden and sitting at the kitchen table where Velma poured tea with a sweetness that disguised its bitter edge. At first, she intended only to charm him, perhaps lean on him for financial help. But the old hunger returned. The thrill of control, the power of holding life and death in her hands. And so, the poisoning began again. Roland never suspected. His health had always been delicate, and when the stomach cramps began, he dismissed them as indigestion. Velma played her role perfectly, fussing over him, preparing meals with tender care, offering comfort as his condition worsened. But what unnerved Velma was that the house seemed to resist her crime. Whenever she stirred the poison into his tea, the light above the table flickered. Sometimes the spoon slipped from her hand as though knocked away by invisible fingers. And at night, when Roland groaned in pain upstairs, Velma swore she heard another sound layered over his suffering, the low, steady whisper of her mother's voice. Don't do this." Velma tried to dismiss it, but Roland noticed her growing unease. "You're as pale as I am," he joked weakly one evening. "Maybe it's me haunting you already." The words chilled her more than he realized. By spring, Roland was bedridden. Velma kept the curtains drawn, the house thick with shadows, and tended to him with a devotion that impressed neighbors. "She lost her mama, and now she's about to lose him," they whispered with pity. But pity turned to suspicion after Roland's sudden decline. The doctor noted the same strange pattern, waves of violent illness followed by brief recoveries. When Roland died in June, his family asked questions Velma wasn't prepared to answer. Why had she insisted on controlling his meals? Why had she been so quick to dismiss his worsening symptoms as nerves? Velma played her part, weeping at the funeral, her body trembling with what looked like grief. Yet inside, she felt only the cold weight of her mother's gaze, watching her from every shadow. And the house grew worse. The rocking chair moved at night even when wedged against the wall. The whispers grew louder, sometimes so clear that Velma clamped her hands over her ears. Doors slammed shut on their own. The smell of bitter almonds, the scent of arsenic, lingered in the kitchen no matter how often she scrubbed. One night, Velma woke to find the Bible she had left on the nightstand lying open on her chest. Her mother's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable, filled the margins of the page. "The wages of sin is death." Velma screamed and hurled the book across the room, but when she picked it up the next morning, the writing was gone. Still, the message clung to her. Neighbors began avoiding her. They said the house made them uneasy, that strange noises carried from the windows at night. A few whispered that Velma had fallen under a curse, that perhaps the devil himself had taken hold of her. Velma, stubborn and defiant, told herself she didn't believe in curses. But when she stood at the foot of her mother's empty bed, listening to the creak of the rocking chair and the whispers that never ceased, even she began to doubt. Because deep down, Velma knew. It wasn't the devil, it was Mama, and she wasn't going to let her go free. Checkmark. That's part 5, 1000 words, keeping the horror supernatural tone while following Velma's real-life killings. Would you like me to make part 6, 1000 words, where Velma's haunting escalates, shadows, visions, and the curse, bleeding into her next crimes, until paranoia starts breaking her mind? Part 6, The Curse of Velma. The summer after Roland's death, Velma could no longer deny that her mother's spirit clung to her like a shadow. Every corner of the house seemed alive with whispers, every mirror caught flickers of movement that vanished when she turned. Sleep became impossible. She would lie awake listening to the creak of the rocking chair upstairs, the soft scrape of feet across the hallway, and the rasp of her mother's voice calling her name. Sometimes she tried to shout back, to command the ghost to leave her alone. But the more she resisted, the stronger it grew. The house itself had turned against her. Floorboards groaning where no one walked, windows rattling even on still nights, doors slamming shut as though an unseen hand shoved them. Velma told herself it was grief, or her nerves, but her heart knew the truth. Mama wasn't gone. And she wasn't forgiving. Velma found herself drifting between fear and obsession. If she was cursed, she reasoned, then she had nothing left to lose. The hunger for control still burned in her blood, and the money from Roland's estate was already dwindling. She needed another man, someone wealthy, someone easy to deceive. That's when she met John Henry Lee. John was a quiet widower from South Carolina, a man of simple habits and modest wealth. He worked the land, rarely raised his voice, and seemed grateful for Velma's attention. Where others might have noticed her sharp eyes and too sweet smile, John saw only a lonely woman who had suffered too much loss. He welcomed her into his life with the openness of a man eager to love again. Velma played the role of doting companion perfectly. She cooked his meals, cleaned his house, and attended church at his side. Neighbors whispered that perhaps Velma had finally found peace, that maybe her string of bad luck had ended. But luck had nothing to do with it. Within weeks of moving in, John began to fall ill. The stomach pains struck suddenly, leaving him doubled over and drenched in sweat. Velma was by his side constantly, spooning broth into his mouth, holding his hand when the fever struck, whispering prayers over his bed. He never suspected that the sickness came from her hands. Yet Velma herself was no longer in control. Each time she mixed the poison into his tea, she felt her mother's presence hovering close. The air in the kitchen would grow icy, her breath fogging in the summer heat. Once, the glass jar of arsenic slipped from her grip and shattered on the floor. She knelt to gather the shards and swore she saw a pair of thin, veined hands reach from the shadows to snatch them away. John's decline was slower than Roland's, and in that stretch of weeks, Velma's mind began to unravel. She dreamed of her mother nightly, dreams where she stood at the foot of the bed, Bible in hand, whispering scripture that Velma could never quite hear. Some nights Velma woke to find her mother's voice filling the room, not as a whisper but a clear command. Confess. Confess before it's too late. Velma tried to drown it out with hymns, but even her singing cracked under the weight of fear. The more she poisoned John, the louder the voice grew. Neighbors began to notice her unraveling. She spoke too quickly, laughed too loudly at church socials, and her hands trembled when she served refreshments. That woman's haunted, one of them whispered. A cloud follows her. They weren't wrong. One stormy night, as John's condition worsened, Velma carried a tray of tea into his room. Thunder shook the windows, and lightning flashed against the walls. She set the cup on the nightstand, but before she could lift it to his lips, the rocking chair across the room began to move. Slowly, steadily, creak, pause, creak. Velma's knees buckled. She clutched the tray, her breath shallow. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Mama, leave me be. The rocking grew louder. John stirred weakly, eyes half open. "Velma," he croaked. "Who's here?" Velma's mouth went dry. She turned, but the chair was empty, yet the cushion bore the weight of an unseen body, the wood groaning under pressure. And then she heard it, louder than ever before. "Don't do this." Velma screamed and hurled the cup of poison tea against the wall. It shattered, liquid dripping down like blood. John, too weak to rise, watched her with wide, terrified eyes. From that night onward, Velma was no longer feared only by others, she began to fear herself. She told John that his illness was God's will, that she was fighting for him with every ounce of strength. But in the dark hours, when she sat alone in the kitchen, she began to wonder if her mother was right. If perhaps she had damned herself. But the hunger wouldn't let go. Velma tightened her grip on John's meals, spooning smaller doses of poison into soups and teas, hoping to finish what she started. Yet every attempt was thwarted. Once, the spoon cracked in half as she stirred. Another time, she found the jar of arsenic missing from its hiding place, only to discover it sitting on her mother's old Bible, as though placed there by invisible hands. The haunting grew unbearable. At night, Velma swore she felt someone sit on the edge of her bed, the mattress sinking under unseen weight. Cold fingers brushed her cheek. Her mother's voice whispered into her ear. "The wages of sin is death. Yours, child, yours." Velma began locking her bedroom door, but it made no difference. The whispers came through the walls, through the cracks in the floor, through the hollow spaces inside her own chest. By the time John finally died, Velma was nearly broken. She buried him quickly, her face streaked with real tears, not for him, but for herself. She knew her mother's spirit would not stop. And she was right. The night after John's funeral, Velma sat in the darkened kitchen with a candle flickering before her. She stared at the flame, hands trembling, when the Bible on the table began to turn its own pages. The sound was sharp in the silence, a quick shuffle of paper as though unseen fingers rifled through. It stopped on the book of Numbers. Velma leaned forward, lips trembling, and read the words before her. "But if you have not turned away from your sin, be sure your sin will find you out." The candle blew out. Velma screamed into the dark. And in the silence that followed, her mother's voice came, calm and close, as though she stood right behind her. "I will not let you escape. Checkmark. That's part 6. 1,000 words. Velma's crimes continue, but the haunting from her mother grows stronger, escalating into physical manifestations and biblical warnings. Part 7. The cracks in her mind. Velma stood before the mirror, her reflection a stranger. Dark hollows bruised the skin beneath her eyes, her once sharp features sagged with exhaustion, and her lips trembled even when she wasn't speaking. She pressed her palms to the cool glass, whispering to herself, "You're still in control. You're still Velma." But the face in the mirror whispered back. At first, it was only a faint murmur, a hiss-like breath slipping through teeth. Then the words grew clearer, forming sentences that matched the cadence of her mother's voice. "Confess, child, confess, or I will take you." Velma staggered backward, knocking a brush from the dresser. It clattered to the floor, and the sound startled her as if it were a gunshot. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the whispers came from inside her skull now, not from the glass. Day and night, her mother's spirit gnawed at her sanity. The house itself seemed alive with malice. Curtains billowed when no wind stirred. Footsteps creaked overhead though no one lived upstairs. Sometimes Velma caught glimpses of a figure moving through the hallways, a shadow in the shape of her mother, head bowed, hands clutching a Bible. She tried to leave the house once. She packed a satchel, filled it with her last bits of money, and opened the front door. But the moment she stepped onto the porch, her legs buckled. A sharp pain lanced through her chest as though invisible hands had seized her heart. She gasped, clawing at the doorframe. The air turned heavy, suffocating, and in the ringing silence she heard it again. "You cannot run from what you've sown." Velma crawled back inside, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that rattled her bones. From that night on, she stopped trying to leave. Instead, she drifted through the house like a prisoner. The neighbors began to talk. They said Velma looked sickly, her once bright dresses replaced with plain, dark gowns. Her hair, once neat, now hung loose and tangled. At church, she muttered to herself during sermons, her lips moving in frantic, silent prayers. "Velma Barfield ain't right," whispered one woman after service. "She looks like the devil's breathing down her neck." Another crossed herself. "Maybe he is." Velma noticed their stares, their whispers. She felt suspicion pressing in on her from all sides. Once, she heard children chanting outside her fence. "Velma's haunted. Velma's cursed." She stormed to the window to shout at them, but froze. Behind the children, in the sunlight, she saw her mother standing on the path. Pale, hollow-eyed, watching. Velma slammed the shutters closed and fell to her knees, sobbing. The hauntings grew more violent. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table, her trembling hands clasped in prayer. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. Suddenly, the clock hands began to spin wildly, whirring until they snapped off and clattered to the floor. The candle beside her flared and went out, plunging her into darkness. Velma felt breath against her ear, hot and damp, and a voice whispered, "Your time is up." She shrieked and stumbled back, knocking the chair over. Her hand brushed against the jar of arsenic she had hidden, and in the next flash of lightning, she swore she saw her mother's skeletal fingers curling around it. Velma snatched the jar and hurled it into the fireplace. The flames hissed, smoke rising in a foul, choking cloud that filled the room with the stench of rot. When the smoke cleared, the jar was whole again, sitting neatly on the mantel. Velma's grip on reality fractured. She began to hear John's voice calling from the grave. At night she would wake to the sound of scratching at her window, as though fingernails dragged across the glass. Once, she opened the curtains to find words scrawled in condensation. Murderous. Sleep abandoned her. She wandered the halls with a lantern, muttering prayers that twisted into curses. Sometimes she screamed into the empty rooms, begging her mother to leave her alone. Other times, she laughed wildly, insisting she was too clever, too strong to be broken. But the truth clawed deeper each day. She was not in control. She was a puppet dangling from unseen strings, jerked this way and that by the restless spirit of the woman who had raised her. One Sunday, Velma collapsed in the middle of the church aisle. The congregation gasped as she convulsed, her body writhing as though gripped by unseen hands. She screamed her mother's name, her voice echoing through the rafters. "Let me go, Mama, let me go." The pastor rushed to her side, placing a hand on her forehead. "She's possessed," someone whispered. Velma's eyes snapped open, black and wild. She clawed at the pastor's sleeve and spat words that chilled every soul present. "She won't let me go. She won't let me rest until I confess." Then she fainted. When she awoke hours later in her bed, she found the congregation had left food on her porch, but none dared enter the house. Even those who once pitied her now feared her. The house became her prison, her mind the battleground. Velma tried everything to rid herself of the curse. She burned candles until the wax dripped like blood. She read the Bible aloud until her throat was raw. She even sprinkled salt across the thresholds, muttering charms she half remembered from childhood. Nothing worked. The final straw came one night when she sat in the parlor, rocking in her mother's old chair. Exhaustion weighed her down, her eyes heavy with sleeplessness. As she drifted into half-dreams, the chair began to rock on its own, faster, harder, until her body jerked violently with each creak. Her mother's voice thundered in her head, louder than ever before. "Confess." Velma screamed until her voice cracked. She clutched her chest, certain her heart would burst. Her vision swam with shadows, and in the blur she saw her mother's face looming over her, skin gray, lips twisted, eyes burning with fury. "Confess," the ghost hissed. Velma fell to the floor, gasping, her nails raking against the wood until they bled. She realized then that there was no escape. The curse would follow her to the grave. Unless she obeyed. Velma rose the next morning with a new resolve. Her eyes were hollow, her body frail, but her voice was steady as she whispered to herself. "I will confess. I must confess. But not to the church. Not to the law. No, she would confess in her own way. In her own time. She would choose the moment. She would control the story. Or so she thought. Check mark. That's part 7. 1000 words. Velma's psychological state spirals out of control, the hauntings intensify, and the community begins to see her as cursed. She resolves to confess, but in her own twisted way. Part 8. The confession. The sky pressed low and heavy over the small Carolina town, gray clouds churning like a sea about to break. Velma sat at her kitchen table, her Bible open but unread, the candle beside it burned down to a stub. Her fingers trembled as she traced the thin paper, but she wasn't reading. She was listening. The house had grown too quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no flicker of shadows. It was the silence before a storm. Her mother was waiting. For 3 nights Velma hadn't slept. The faces of her victims haunted her. John, her mother, her neighbors, even those she had poisoned but claimed were accidents. Their eyes followed her, accusing, hollow, endless. But it was her mother's voice that commanded them. Confess, child, speak your sins, or your soul is mine. Velma finally decided. She could not escape the curse. But she could choose where it ended. She dressed in black, pulling her hair back tight. From the mantel, she took the arsenic jar and wrapped it in cloth, placing it inside her satchel. Her hands shook, but she forced them still. Tonight, she would go to the church. Not to pray, not to beg forgiveness, to confess. The night air clung to her like a damp shroud as Velma walked the dirt road toward the chapel. Each step echoed louder than the last, though her shoes barely touched the ground. The trees leaned inward, branches clawing at her dress, and the crickets' song stuttered and died as she passed. Halfway there, she felt the familiar grip at her chest. A cold, iron weight pressing down. She stopped, gasping, clutching her satchel. No, Mama, not tonight. I'm going. The air shifted, leaves rustled though no wind stirred. From the ditch rose a pale figure, shrouded in mist. Her mother. Her face was not whole. Half of it had rotted away, revealing bone beneath, but her eyes glowed with fire. She pointed a skeletal finger at Velma, and the ground trembled. Confess. Velma fell to her knees, choking, but lifted her chin. I will, Mama, let me do it. The figure wavered, then vanished. The night returned to stillness. Velma staggered to her feet and hurried on. The church stood against the horizon like a dark sentinel. The windows glowed faintly with candlelight. The pastor often prayed late into the night. Velma pushed open the heavy wooden doors. They groaned, the sound echoing like a scream in the hollow sanctuary. Inside, the air was thick with incense and smoke. At the altar, Pastor Whitfield knelt, his lips moving in silent prayer. He turned when he heard her. His eyes widened at the sight of her gaunt figure in the doorway. Velma, his voice trembled. Child, what brings you here at this hour? She walked slowly down the aisle, her satchel clutched tight. Shadows followed her, stretching long across the pews. I came to confess, she whispered. The pastor rose to his feet. Confess. To what, my dear? Velma dropped the satchel on the altar. The jar of arsenic clinked as it rolled onto the wood. The pastor's face paled. Velma's voice cracked but grew stronger with every word. I killed them. All of them. My husband, my mother, my neighbors. I gave them poison. I watched them die. I did it with these hands. Her body shook as she lifted her trembling fingers. And now she won't leave me alone. She makes me see her, hear her, even feel her clawing at me. My own mother. The pastor stepped back, horror etched into his face. Velma, do you realize what you're saying? Velma laughed, a high, broken sound. Oh, I realize. I've realized for months. I can't eat. I can't sleep. The house is alive with her spirit. She'll never stop until I confess. Her voice echoed through the chapel, rattling the stained glass windows. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the church into darkness. The pastor gasped, Lord, have mercy. From the shadows rose a figure, pale, skeletal, draped in rags. Velma's mother. She stood behind the altar, eyes burning, mouth gaping open in a scream that no one heard but Velma. Velma dropped to her knees, sobbing. There. Do you see her? She's here. She won't let me rest. The pastor saw nothing, but he felt the air grow cold, his breath misting before him. He clutched his Bible tight. Velma screamed, "What more do you want from me, Mama?" I confessed. I confessed. The figure reached for her, its hands skeletal, claws dripping shadow. Velma convulsed, clutching her chest, her body racked with pain. "No, please, Mama, not yet." Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed to the floor, twitching. The jar of arsenic shattered, white dust spilling across the altar like snow. Dash dash dash. The pastor rushed to her side, calling her name, but Velma's body grew stiff, her lips trembling with her final words. "She won't forgive me, she'll never forgive me." Her breath rattled once, then stilled. The church fell silent, but Pastor Whitfield swore he heard it, just for a moment, an echo that wasn't Velma's voice. "Confess. Dash dash dash." By morning, word spread through the town. Velma Barfield, the woman cursed by her own sins, had died in the church during a midnight confession. Some said it was the weight of guilt that killed her. Others whispered it was her mother's hand that reached from the grave. But everyone agreed on one thing. When her coffin was lowered into the ground, the earth shuddered. And some nights, when the wind swept through the cemetery, people swore they could hear a woman's voice carried with it. Confess. Dash dash dash. Checkmark. That's part 8. 1000 words. The climax of Velma's haunting. She brings her poison to church, confesses her murders, but her mother's spirit takes her anyway. Part 9. The curse spreads. The church bells tolled at dawn. Though no hand pulled the rope, their hollow clang echoed through the empty streets, summoning the townsfolk to the chapel where Velma Barfield's body still lay cold on the floor. Pastor Whitfield hadn't moved her. He sat slumped in the front pew, Bible clutched to his chest, his eyes wild and sleepless. The night replayed in his mind, Velma's confession, her sudden collapse, the icy shadow that seemed to crawl over him when her last breath left her lips. The townsfolk entered quietly, whispering, their faces pale in the dim light. They gazed at Velma's body, at the shattered glass of the arsenic jar scattered across the altar. The powder still clung to the wood like frost. She confessed to murder, the pastor muttered hoarsely, standing at last. His voice shook. She confessed to them all. She said, her mother came for her. The people shifted uneasily. No one doubted it. Everyone in town knew Velma had been cursed since her mother's death. But no one expected the curse to remain after Velma was gone. Dash dash dash. The first sign. 2 nights after her burial, old man Harris, the gravedigger, staggered into the tavern with his face ashen and his clothes caked in soil. His hands trembled so violently he couldn't hold a mug of ale. "She's still alive," he whispered. The tavern fell silent. "What are you sayin', Harris?" a farmer asked. "I buried her with my own hands. I packed the dirt solid. But last night, I heard it scratching from under the earth, like nails on wood." The men exchanged nervous glances. A woman crossed herself and hurried out the door. And then, Harris choked. "I heard a voice. Her voice. Whisperin' one word." His eyes glazed with terror. "Confess. Dash dash dash." The pastor's torment. Meanwhile, Pastor Whitfield had taken to locking himself inside the church each night. He lit every candle, read every psalm, but nothing drowned out the sound of that single word. Confess. It followed him in the rafters, in the whisper of the stained glass windows rattling in their frames. He heard it when he closed his eyes, when he opened his Bible, even when he pressed his hands over his ears. He tried to convince himself it was guilt. He had failed Velma. He should have sought redemption for her soul instead of recoiling in horror. But deep down, he knew. The curse hadn't died with Velma. Dash dash dash. The neighbors. In the days that followed, more townsfolk reported strange happenings. Mrs. Carter, who had quarreled with Velma weeks before her death, woke to find her chickens dead, their throats blackened as if burned by poison. On her doorstep lay a single note scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Confess." The Miller boy swore he saw a woman in black standing outside the cemetery at night, her head bowed, her hands clasped. But when he shouted, she raised her face, and it was Velma, her skin crawling with worms, her lips moving silently. He fainted on the spot. Others claimed their wells had soured, their water tasting faintly of metal. Livestock dropped without warning. Children grew feverish and pale. The town began to murmur. The curse was spreading. The town meeting. A gathering was called in the church hall. The room was thick with fear, every pew filled. "This is the devil's work," cried one man. "No," said another, shaking his head. "It's Velma. She won't rest. She wants us to confess, like she did." "Confess to what?" a woman snapped. "We've done nothing." The room fell into uneasy silence. Because they all knew that wasn't true. Every soul in that room carried some sin. Theft, betrayal, lies, violence. Small things, perhaps, but sins nonetheless. Pastor Whitfield stood at the pulpit, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling as he held the Bible. "She told us the truth," he said. "She said the dead won't forgive her, and now they won't forgive us either. Unless," he hesitated, glancing around the room. "Unless we confess." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "You want us to speak our sins aloud?" Mrs. Carter spat, in front of everyone. "Never." The pastor's voice grew hoarse, desperate. "Then the curse will consume us all." A sudden gust of wind burst through the church doors, extinguishing the candles. Darkness swallowed the room, and in it, a voice slithered through every ear, low, guttural, unmistakable. "Confess." The townsfolk screamed. When the candles were relit, every pew was empty. The curse deepens. That night, doors slammed by themselves. Windows shattered inward. The air grew foul, heavy with rot. And everywhere, written in soot, in mud, even in blood smeared across walls, appeared the same word. Confess. Some tried to flee the town, but their horses bucked and refused to move past the crossroads. One wagon overturned, killing the driver instantly. On his chest, carved deep into the flesh, were the letters, CONFESS. By the week's end, panic had turned to madness. Husbands accused wives, children turned against parents, neighbors shouted sins at each other in the street. It wasn't redemption, it was chaos. And Velma's voice only grew louder. The pastor's last hope. On the seventh night, Pastor Whitfield returned to Velma's grave. The earth above it had cracked open as if something had clawed from within. The headstone leaned forward, split down the middle. The pastor fell to his knees. "Velma," he whispered, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "What do you want from us? What must we do?" The ground shuddered beneath him. A skeletal hand shot through the dirt, clawing at the air. Velma's corpse dragged itself halfway from the grave, her eyes burning with a terrible light. Her jaw opened wide, a voice like thunder bursting from her throat. "Confess," the pastor screamed, scrambling backward. We will confess. I swear it." Velma's corpse froze. Slowly, she sank back into the earth, the soil folding over her once more. The night grew silent, but the message was clear. The curse would not end until every soul in town spoke their sins aloud. Epilogue of Part 9. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered at the cemetery, their faces hollow with fear. One by one, they began to confess theft, envy, betrayal, adultery, even darker deeds that no one had ever suspected. But with every confession, the air only grew heavier. It wasn't redemption Velma wanted. It was dominion, and the town, once bound by silence, was unraveling by its own words. The curse had not ended. It had only begun. Checkmark. That's Part 9. 1,000 words. The curse spreads after Velma's death, forcing the entire town to confess, but instead of salvation, it plunges them into chaos and madness. Do you want Part 10, the finale, to be a fiery conclusion where the whole town is consumed by Velma's curse, or more of a lingering haunting ending, leaving the reader unsettled with the thought that the curse still whispers to this day? Part 10, the last confession. The cemetery became a stage of madness. By the time the sun rose on the 8th day, nearly the entire town had gathered among the gravestones. Men, women, and even children stood in ragged circles, eyes wild, lips trembling. The ground reeked of damp soil and rot, the air thick with a silence that pressed on their lungs. Velma's grave sat in the center, its earth cracked open like a festering wound. The people whispered to one another, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid of the word that lingered in their ears, growing heavier with each passing second. Confess. Dash dash dash. A town undone. At first, the confessions came quietly. A farmer admitted he had poisoned his neighbor's cow out of spite. A widow whispered that she had stolen coins from the church offering plate. Children, trembling, confessed to lies they had told their parents. But soon, the murmurs turned to shouts. Wives accused husbands of betrayal. Brothers shouted about greed. Blood spilled as fists flew, because the more they confessed, the more the whispers urged them onward. It wasn't enough. Confess everything. Voices roared inside their skulls, though no lips moved. The crowd became a frenzy. People screamed their sins to the heavens, tearing at their own flesh, begging for release. The cemetery became a pit of hysteria. And still, Velma's grave pulsed with a sickly glow. Dash dash dash. Pastor Whitfield's breaking point. Pastor Whitfield watched in horror, clutching his Bible to his chest. His congregation, his people, were unraveling before his eyes, driven mad by Velma's command. He dropped to his knees at the edge of her grave, his tears soaking into the soil. Velma, he cried, what more do you want? They've confessed. We all have. End this curse. The ground shuddered. Cracks split across the cemetery, gravestones toppling like broken teeth. From the rift, a shape began to rise, a shadow, tall and twisted, wearing the vague outline of Velma Barfield, though her face was hollow and her eyes burned with hellfire. The townsfolk screamed, scattering, but the voice thundered across the night, rattling bones and hearts alike. Confess. The pastor bowed his head. He knew what she wanted. He had known all along. It wasn't the people's confessions she craved. It was his. Dash dash dash. The final sin. With shaking hands, he opened his Bible, not to read from it, but to reveal what he had hidden inside. A folded page, stained with age and ink. A confession of his own. He had killed his brother years ago. Out of jealousy, out of rage, he had buried the truth beneath sermons, hymns, and prayers, convincing himself he had been forgiven. But Velma's curse knew. The dead knew. He raised the page high above his head, his voice breaking as he screamed. I confess it all. The paper caught fire in his hands, igniting with a blue flame that spread to his robes, to the grass, to the very earth itself. The townsfolk fell silent, watching as Pastor Whitfield burned. His screams turned to a ragged chant. I confess. I confess. I confess. The shadow of Velma leaned forward, her hollow face almost tender as she reached into the fire. Her fingers brushed against the pastor's heart, then yanked it free. With a final wail, his body collapsed into ash. Dash dash dash. The curse unleashed. The fire did not die. It spread outward from the graveyard, racing across the fields, leaping into the houses, devouring wood, stone, flesh. The people tried to flee, but the roads twisted back on themselves. No matter how far they ran, they found themselves once again at the cemetery, facing Velma's burning shadow. The air filled with screams. Smoke swallowed the sky, and through it all, one word rose above the chaos. Confess. Dash dash dash. The end of the town. By dawn, nothing remained. The church, the tavern, the homes, everything had been reduced to charred ruins. The air stank of smoke and decay. Crows perched on blackened beams, pecking at the ashes of what had once been a thriving town. In the cemetery, Velma's grave stood untouched, her name etched deeper into the stone than ever before. The soil pulsed faintly, as though something beneath it still breathed. Travelers passing through years later spoke of the silence that clung to the ruins, of how no birds sang, no animals roamed. They claimed that if you stood in the center of the cemetery at night, you could still hear the whisper carried on the wind. Confess. And sometimes, those who visited never returned. Dash dash dash. Legacy of the curse. Generations later, the story of Velma Barfield lived on, retold in hushed voices around firesides. Some claimed she had been a murderer driven mad by guilt. Others swore she was a martyr, chosen to drag sinners into the grave. But those who dared visit the ruins knew the truth. It wasn't about Velma anymore. It was about the curse itself, alive, hungry, waiting. Because once you hear the whisper, it never leaves you. It clings to your heart, your thoughts, your dreams. It waits for you to speak your darkest truth. And if you refuse, It takes everything. Dash dash dash. Final words. And so, dear listener, remember this. The dead do not rest when lies bind the living. The dead demand confession. And perhaps tonight, when you lie in bed with the lights off, if the room grows colder, if you hear a faint whisper in the dark, don't ignore it. Don't wait. Confess. Dash dash dash. Checkmark call to action for your audience. If you enjoyed this terrifying tale of Velma Barfield and the Curse of Confession, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more chilling horror stories. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What would you do if you heard that whisper in the night? Dash dash dash. That's the final part, 1000 words, with a strong creepy ending and a direct call to action for your audience.